This just in from the Portland transcript. Schooner war continues. Canada captures another American schooner. Gloucester, Massachusetts captain vows revenge. From the Wigan Courier, late edition, Gloucester lost his mount. Fourth schooner this season captured near Canso, Nova Scotia. And the Boston Daily Globe asks, when will President Grant take notice? Gloucester fleet suffers another loss to the Canadian pirates. Meanwhile, from up north, the Nova Scotia packet celebrates. Yet another Yankee fisherman caught. Schooner Edward A. Horton seized to Guysborough. Hoorah for Canada's rights. Avenging the Edward A. Horton, a novel by Tommy Carbone. Based on the true story of the American Gloucester schooner captured by the Canadian authorities in 1871. Narrated by the author. Copyright 2024 by Burnt Jacket Publishing and Tommy Carbone. For additional information on this title and other books, please visit TommyCarbone.com. This is the song of the seaman, bending low at the haul. This is the song of the fisher, tending his miles of trawl. This is the song of the reefer, changing suits in a squall. This is the story of the Horton, a Gloucester schooner, avenging the rights of all. Chapter 1. A Patriot Wronged. I purchased a glass of stiff Gloucester grog for a salty son of the sea, and he confidently leaned on the bar and spun this yarn for me. An old 1800s ballad. October 10th, 1870. Herrick Tavern, Gloucester, Massachusetts. A meeting of Captains J. William Gott and Harvey Knowlton, Jr. It was unavoidable, I tell ye. His two fists caused a wave of ale to jump from his mug, roll across the tilted pine log table, and onto his bait-stained wool pants. The seaman shook as he made his statement, not out of cowardice, but from disbelief and anger. We were outnumbered 2 men to 1, and we unarmed except our harpoons and gigs. I tell ye, Captain, we were no match. Once they showed their Union Jack colors with drawn bayonets. He drained what remained of his ale in one swallow. The scoundrels violated every rule of the sea, coming up alongside under false pretense, disguised as a fisherman and even flying the stars and stripes. The crewmen watching from up in the nest saw no concern for alarm on their deck until it was too late. It wasn't any fault of his, and I told him so. His hairy hand lifted the dented tin mug, and he banged it on the table 3 times. Then they stripped her naked and kept her in the harbor under watch. The bar wench, on her continuous rounds, replaced his empty with a full mug. A silver ready in my hand, I dropped it in her apron pocket. I gave her a nod to leave a second mug next to my still nearly full first. My eyes fixated on the raised plate design on the stein. A 2-masted schooner, bare booms, idle at berth. It was like having sharp cod salt rubbed into my open wounds. I pressed the lid of the mug open with my thumb. "Did you get a good look at any of them?" I asked. The captain in my employ raised his head to me. His black eyes, nearly hidden behind his bushy brows and puffy beard that had creeped up his cheeks during 6 months at sea, bored into me. "You bet I did, Captain Knowlton. If I was as good with a brush as with a tuna spike, I could paint you a portrait of the arrogant leader." His eyes narrowed at the thought of the scoundrel. "What was the name of their ship?" "Hag, can you believe it? She was the Sweepstakes. They be no better than pirates after bounty, if you ask me." "And the captain's name?" "I'll never forget it until the day I die. Reminded me of those traitorous Bostoners who had no spine. Tory, it was." The emphasis he placed on the name caused his dried saliva to blow from his upper lip, Jonathan Torrey. This full name he stated with a drawn-out growl. Were you able to take off my grandfather's instruments? It was a question I had to ask the captain, for the navigational instruments were of sentimental value to me. Captain Gott shook his head. The crusty seaman brushed at his billowy black beard. His tone softened. I sure miss the Lily Rose. Him taking her from me, I mean from you, Captain. It just isn't right. I lifted my mug. The warm ale complimented the bitter story Captain Gott told of how it came about he lost command of the Lily Rose Snow. She was a new schooner to the Gloucester fleet of the firm Mackenzie, Knowlton and Horton. As a major stock owner in the company bearing my family's name, I was determined to acquire my rightful property once again. The Dominion government had overstepped its claims on too many United States fishing vessels. It was time to take a stand, even if President Grant couldn't be bothered to protect our vessels, our livelihood, and our American rights on the high seas. Before going home to Rocky Neck, I wired an update to my partner. Edward Horton was, on that day, in D.C. lobbying the United States Fishing Commissioners on behalf of our firm's affairs and for all the Gloucester vessel owners. He was on an errand, for which purpose to most every owner was common sense and shouldn't have needed explaining, and that being our rights to earn a living from that which the seas provide and to be unmolested while doing so. Letter to Captain Horton. 10th October, 1870. Edward A. Horton, care of Willard Hotel, Washington, D.C. Captain Horton. Captain J. William Gott returned from Canso by rail with crew. I've assigned him to captain the Phantom to Long Island Sound. Best to keep him away from the Dominion waters for a time. Doing the same with my brother Joseph will not be as easily managed. Better you than me to be speaking with a Massachusetts congressional delegation on this matter. I certainly do not have the patience for their excuses in protecting the scandalous president who seems to be more interested in gold prices than protection of the Union citizens and property. If you should see Mr. President smoking his cigar in the hotel lobby, be cautious. He may consider you a lobbyist in requesting he perform his duty to protect the property of the citizens of these United States. Sincerely, Harvey Knowlton, Jr. Chapter 2. The Chase. 1 year later. Our captain's name all know was Knowlton, our first mate's the last the same. Our schooner she hailed from Gloucester town, and the Horton was her name, brave boys, and the Horton was her name. An old sea ballad. Thursday, September 7th, 1871, 9 p.m., off Cape Jock, Nova Scotia. Captain Joseph Knowlton stood alongside his first mate at the chart table. He removed from his pocket the telegram and placed it in the drawer of ship's correspondence. The message from his older brother Harvey, received at the last port, was of the usual tone. Remain cautious and stand your rightful ground. A lantern secured to the quarter's ceiling rocked to the sway of the waves. The younger man examined the chart. He traced an arc across the Northumberland Strait to Point Prim Light with his divider. "Humph," grunted the captain. "You're troubling yourself for naught. We're well outside any imaginary 3-mile line, even if Dominion measurements are double or triple scale to suit their whims." Without looking up, the mate measured another line from the tip of Cape John to the tip of Point Prim. "Humph!" Captain Knowlton walked close to the chart. 17 miles by your mark." He waited for a reply. "Well?" "Aye, Captain. 17 miles." "You go up and get a sight on Prim Light." Captain Knowlton handed his first mate a spyglass. "The steersman will have her 7 miles northwest on the horizon at this hour." Without a word, Mate Oliver started for the ladder. "And, because, my young nephew, you've questioned my navigation, you can have the watch until 4 bells. Oliver Knowlton paused on the top step. He'd only been checking the charts out of interest in learning. He hadn't meant anything by it towards his uncle's bearings. Now, having to remain awake until the men turned out of their berths, meant he'd be getting no rest before the difficult work sending began. He held his tongue. The captain, seeing the mate pause, added to his orders with a shout through the open cabin door. "Mate, outfit the 2 dories and send for victuals and water while you're on watch." Up on deck, Oliver didn't bother to look through the glass. The Knowlton skippers had been fishing these Canadian waters for 4 generations. He trusted Captain Joseph Knowlton knew his ship's exact position in the strait between Prince Edward Island and the Nova Scotia mainland, and the captain knew it as well as the mate at the wheel holding the course. Oliver stood by the rail gazing out over the dark, endless water. Infrequent breaks in the clouds displayed shimmers of moonlight, riding the crest of waves across the channel. He struck a match to his pipe bowl. It wasn't the captain's navigation that was worrying Oliver's mind. No, it was the tactics of the American fisherman's enemy. With the situation beyond his control, he went about his work obeying orders to ensure all was ready in the dories. The dorymen were his responsibility and his single concern that night. He stocked the bow's tiny dory locker with filled water jugs, cheeses, and hardtack. The dories, like the Seine, required food and water for a day's fishing, and more importantly, for 3 days' survival, in the event she was separated from the vessel. When the food was stored, he inspected the bailer, bell, horn, lantern, handline, thole pins, stern plug, and the painters. A frayed painter was removed, and a newly repaired line of hemp was tied in its place. The mate went about his work without distraction. He knew the importance of his task, for it was 3 years ago that 2 dorymen were caught in the fog and blown away from a Knowlton Company schooner. One was crew member and close family friend, Frank Sweeney. Frank and his dory mate rowed for 5 days until beaching on the coast of Newfoundland, surviving on what little water they had in a jug, catching rain in their southwesters, and eating raw fish. Simple dory supply kits had since become a standard on all Mackenzie, Knowlton, and Horton vessels. Other Gloucester vessels hadn't yet taken up the practice. Oliver inspected the gear while trying to wash out the early interaction with his uncle, or rather the captain. But the words rolled round and round in his head. Joseph Knowlton as captain was never wrong. Not as long as he'd sailed with him, or anyone had sailed under any Knowlton master. He pulled tight to knot the bow tarpaulin down. His thoughts turned to the stories he'd heard from his uncles and grandfathers. In their years, fishermen never had to consider outfitting the dories for fishing on the seas. They hadn't a need to. The earlier generations fished mackerel with hook and line from the deck of the vessel. The surface-feeding mackerel were lured alongside with chum dropped overboard. Fishing was done with lines rigged with jigs, a bulb of lead fashioned with hooks all around it. A line fisherman would handle 7 or 8 lines from the deck. Once dories came into use, then the fishermen fished on the open sea, untethered, sometimes 3 miles from their vessel in those years. 8 or more dories were set with 2-man crews, spread out across the vast ocean, with no other power to get back than their arms and oars. It seemed the newer method, using a single larger seine boat and a single dory to close the net, was safer and more productive than all those dories left to drift over the waves, invisible in the often present fog of the banks. Yet fishing from the deck was dangerous too. His grandfather and crew of 18 were lost in the Georges gale of 1851, along with 7 other vessels of the Gloucester fleet. Men died from being swept overboard or when the vessels plunged into the sea, split into pieces under the force of the gale. "Oh, there, mate." Oliver turned to see his crewmate Duncan. "Oh, you got the early watch, I see," said Duncan as he passed. "And the late as well," returned Oliver. He watched Duncan step to the deck box, where he began to grind bait into chum, barrels of which they'd throw overboard to attract the schools of mackerel. Oliver leaned against the rail under the forestaysail. His pipe smoke mixed with the smell of the herring Duncan was cleaving into chunks. The beacon from Prim Light flashed. Sure enough, as the captain knew from even his position below deck, the light was northwest. The beacon, At the horizon indicated to Oliver, the Horton was drifting beyond twice the 3 miles from the northern shore. For Oliver, the youngest of the crew, 6 miles from land wasn't enough margin to be complacent. There was always a good chance to be boarded by the Dominion cuttermen. He felt the Canadian revenue cutter captains were merely government-sponsored pirates. With angst, he searched the sea for ship's lanterns, worrying which might not be friendly to their occupation. For 4 long, dark hours, Oliver watched the sea surface for signs of mackerel and the horizon for other vessels. At the bottom of each hour, he updated the log with the relative location of the vessels in the strait. On a significant deviation, he reported at once to the steersman on duty to ensure all eyes stayed alert. The two fishermen passed a few moments together guessing the names of the neighboring vessels, none of which were within 3 miles of the Horton. The ships were too far off in the gray of the night to determine if they were American or Canadian, never mind a particular vessel they might know. Their diversion was mostly for conversation during the lonely night hours on deck. Diligently, Oliver made the rounds of his watch. He ensured 2 men were manning the pumps and neither was asleep. He checked the Horton's red and green beacons to ensure they were shining with plenty of oil to burn. In the galley, when he turned in for a mug-up, he made short conversation with the crew members who were too anxious to sleep. All were waiting on the mackerel. Mates Duncan and Cornelius sat on lockers near the cook stove. Oliver mediated their argument on the finer points of handling a send net. All rummaged the food locker for grub the cook had set for the night crew. One fisherman sat on the floor with his legs braced against the mast, a lantern swinging in its gimbal over his head. In his right hand he held one of the captain's books. In his left, a mug of coffee with a touch of rum. It was a known fact from Boston to Portland that the Knowlton skippers always shipped with a fair library aboard their vessels. Though volumes of stories were available to any crew member wishing to crack the spine, there were always a few fishermen who sought the schooners in order to read the latest books, stories they'd share with their children when home. Oliver bent his head to read the title on the spine of the book his mate was holding. He'd read all the books of the Horton shelves at least once. "You planning on trading down to a birch bark, Anson?" "Nay. Seems this Walden woodsman and his Indian guide carried their boat through Maine more than they paddled it." Back on deck, through the hours of the night, various crew came and went performing their duties without being told. Oliver lent a hand to keep himself awake. The send net was checked, barrels were lashed to the rails, all loose items were stored away below. With the wind coming up, all was made ready to drive the Horton to beat the other vessels to the catch, no matter if they were Canadian or American ships. It'd be each vessel for themselves once the mackerel surfaced and the chase was underway. At 3:30, Oliver heard the cook's call. "Ho, ho! Mug up, all you Gloucester hearties! Ho, ho! Roll out, mug up or miss out!" Relieved of his watch by a fisherman who had slept soundly for 6 hours, Oliver proceeded to the skipper's quarters. He set the captain's mug squarely in the table's hold. "All prepared, mate?" Captain Joseph, his right upper cheek still covered in shaving soap, looked at Oliver in the clouded mirror over the washbowl. "Aye, Captain. The lead dory is prepared, as is a second, along with the send boat. The men are turned out in their oilskins." "Very well." Oliver watched as Joseph drew the blade along his cheek. He found the captain's morning ritual odd. With a full facial beard, the captain was known to keep his cheeks freshly shaven, and particularly so when they were to be off chasing a school of mackerel. "You'll be aloft, mate." The skipper wiped the remaining soap from his face. "Not in the dory, Captain?" asked Oliver, taking in his own face in the mirror. He pulled at the blonde hair of his 4-month beard, thinking he could use a shave himself. Tossing the towel aside, Knowlton faced his nephew. "You'd rather be on the water, mate." "Captain, you've always put me in the dory. I figured—" "It's high time you had a larger stake in bringing this vessel to Gloucester with a full hold." With that, the captain headed for the companionway. Oliver followed. He watched the captain climb down over the rail into the send boat with the men. Oliver gave the orders to raise full sail. When he reached the top of the mast, The first hint of dawn was lightening the horizon in the east. He turned his head northwest to keep his eyes accustomed to the dark. The fate of the men's take would be on him. He squinted, searching for the phosphorescent signs of mackerel trails across the surface of the water. Chants rose from the men of the Seine boats already being towed by their vessels. The singing drifted across the strait, mixing with the off-tuned squawks of the gulls who'd arrived in anticipation of a chase. From north, south, and west, muffled echoes of shanties rose from the fishermen all readying to drive for the fish. Aft of the Horton, the Seine and dory in tow on painters, his own crewmates sang. A Yankee sloop came down the street. Ha ha, Rolling John! What do you think that sloop had in her? Ha ha, Rolling John! Mackerel to the deck, all hooked within 3 miles ashore. Ha ha, Rolling John! Oliver grimaced. He thought the men ought not to sing such a song when a cutter could be lurking in the dark close enough to hear. Be ready, men. The captain's command was literal, as well Oliver knew, in order to change their tune. They obeyed, but would sing until the Seine boat painter was cast off the Horton stern, for then it'd be all work, their sweat mingling with sea spray, until the last fish was hauled over the rail and sent below. Singing row, 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 bullies row, oh, the Gloucester girls, they've got us in tow. In watching the red and green vessel beacons scattered over Northumberland, Oliver noticed a near vessel trimming sails. He yelled down to the steersman, Nor by nor'west. Captain Knowlton stood in the Seine boat, adjusted his sou'wester to hold in the breeze, and wondered if Oliver was going to be brash enough to crowd the other vessel. He made no comment. Oliver directed the steersman, 1 point eastward, and mind that green light leeward. 1 point east, yes, green light leeward, yelled the man at the wheel. Within 5 minutes, Oliver commanded they tack back west toward Prim Light. He called to the deckhands, Slack the foretops halyards. The topsail slapped in the wind. The cook poked his head up from the galley. Oliver, I've got the dinner cooking. The way you're driving the Horton, the chowder will be more in my pockets than in the pot. Sorry, mate. We'll be holding this course. Oliver watched the sea. And cook, you'd better close down the stove and get in your oilskins. Aye, aye, sir. The cook hustled down to his locker. In the Seine boat, the skipper commanded the crew. All right, boys, be ready. Ready? It seems mate Oliver's driving us in circles, stated Anson. The Seine fishermen readying their oars laughed. Nay, the captain yelled, pointing to his mate in the crow's nest. That there's the first college man in the Knowlton family. I figure he's calculating on something only he can see. Duncan and Cornelius and the dory were laughing and singing. Mark it in your book, Duncan. This will be a day we have the Jonah, chided Cornelius to his dory mate. Aye, I ought to charge the captain for my loss of a day's fish. Why he'd give his position in the mast to that boy is irresponsible. Oliver couldn't find a mackerel in a fish house. Their banter went on and on. They were simply along for the ride behind the schooner until a school of fish might be spotted. Cornelius opened the wooden locker to see what food might be aboard. He broke off a piece of the cook's molasses cake to share with Duncan. The phosphorescent green streaking over the water wasn't visible to the crew of 12 in the Seine boat, nor could the 2-man crew of the dory see it. The extra hands on deck would have been hard-pressed to know where to look. Only Oliver, high in the mast, began to smile. The school had turned and evaded the pursuing northbound vessel. By the movement of the ships to the north and west they had taken notice of the same. The streak of green was headed down the strait, right toward the Horton. Cast the painter, Oliver yelled. Drag that net northward, men, he pointed. Without delay or further humor, the crew heaved the net. The Seine men rowed. They sang, Row, 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 bullies row. In the dory, Duncan and Cornelius sang the loudest to make up for their loneliness compared to the 12 men in the Seine. The pair were 2 of the crew who were most fond of the shanties. Together they sang a harmony that added a depth to the chant. With each line of the song they fed their end of the net and let the current pull them away from the Seine boat. The caulk buoys on the top rope bobbed on the waves. In their excitement and jolly singing, they'd only then noticed their predicament. This caused a lapse of judgment, and Connie let the end of the net go as he bent low into the boat to check under the seats. Captain Knowlton was too busy at first to notice that the dory had drifted away in the wrong direction. When he saw the net sagging, he stood and gazed into the darkness. The swells hid the dory at first. He tried to hear what seemed like an argument between his two dorymen, their arms flailing at one another. "What's the trouble?" Knowlton called out. "Row in here and help." "Can't, Captain." The dory was carried farther away on the wind and waves. "Why the blazes not?" the captain yelled through cupped hands. "We would, but wouldn't you know, Oliver left us without oars fastened on the sides, Captain." Just then Oliver rang his bell and yelled from the mast. "School is under a half-mile. She's a raft and coming strong, Captain." Captain Knowlton stared at his two helpless fishermen who were drifting away on the rises of the sea. He checked where Oliver was pointing. He assessed the swells, the tide, and the distance to the shore against his obligation to fill the hold and pay his men and the owners. The crests and troughs weren't anything unusual for a dory to handle. Besides, with the fish approaching, there was no time to row for the dory. It was the men or the fish. "Don't worry, Captain. Oliver left us plenty of food, if not the oars. Swing back after you haul the school. Now go drive her, boys, drive her. Keep your lanterns lit until the sky is light. Throw a drogue out if you've got one." Captain Knowlton only left those two men to the mercy of the sea, for he knew they were able seamen, and it was a calm sea. Calm enough for a Gloucester man, anyway. Cornelius had already tied the largest bucket they had to a painter and heaved it over. If it slowed their drifting at all, he hadn't noticed. It was only then that Oliver noticed the dory not in position. His attention left the splashes of the speeding school. The fish were headed directly towards the chum and the waiting send net. They were as good as being sold back at Gloucester. He commanded the deckhands to drop the spare dory over the rail and to help with the net. Then he left the fishing to the crew and kept his eyes focused on the two men who would need saving. "Pull that line tight, men," Captain Knowlton yelled to the hands in the spare dory. "Don't let it slack, or they'll go right over us." Whether it was their confusion from all the boats in the strait, the rising sun, or dumb luck, but that school swam themselves directly into the Horton send net. There was no need of a chase, with the men having a mile of hard rowing to get in range of the fish. All the fishermen in that send boat that day would swear it was the easiest catch they ever made, and one of the fullest nets that ever circled around a school. From his position high on the mast, Oliver could tell the school was going to be a heavy haul. He took a final bearing on the drifting dory, and when the Horton eased alongside the send boat, he slid down the rigging. Along with the steersman, the cook, and the extra hands, they secured the weighted net between the Horton and the boat. Then the men went to work heaving those fish up over the rail. The dip net, on a rope of the strongest Cebu hemp, was lowered into the deeply stretched send. The captain called out, "Heave-ho!" On deck, the crew tugged with a chant. "Pull, pull, pull, bullies, pull! Oh, how the Gloucester girls are waiting at home!" Over and over the dip net went. Repeated again and again went their chant. The fish were placed on the ice that was put aboard at Cancel 3 days prior. 4 small 30-pound halibut were pulled from the net and placed in a barrel off to the side, in order the cook could smoke them for the crew. There was no time for noon dinner. Even the cook hadn't had a moment to leave the deck. Not until the fish were packed, the net was straightened in the send boat, and the dory was hauled over the rail, did the captain shout his order. "Set sail for Cape Jock." Together at the wheel, the captain and Oliver consulted the tide, the wind, and the last known drift path of the lost dory. She'd been out of their sight for hours. "They'll be southeast for certain." The captain knew so by dead reckoning. Oliver wouldn't dare question it. Down below, the crew had removed their oilskins and were having a mug while warming themselves by the stove in the forecastle. "You don't suppose Cornelius and Duncan weren't smashed on the shag rocks of Cape Jock in the combers, do you?" asked Anson, his pipe hanging from the corner of his lip. "More likely Connie blasted up those rocks into Pebble Beach with his swearing alone, in order to make a soft landing," said another. While the men made light of their missing crew, all were worried about the two men. Although the seas weren't stormy that day, they knew the tide through the strait brought rollers to make a ride in a dory unnerving, especially without the means to steer into the rises. "Most likely they've been picked up and are having a rum in a tavern by now," said the cook. Nods of agreement came from the exhausted men, who all knew the Northumberland Strait was full of sail and steam vessels in the chase for the season-ending mackerel run. "We ought to find them easy enough, as long as the captain doesn't take us into the Amet Island shoals to retrieve those two," said a fisherman who was consulting a chart of the strait. "It'd be mighty embarrassing to run aground here." "Nay, mate, never he'd do that. He'd send us out in the Seine before taking the Horton in there," replied Anson. As it turned out, the dory holding Cornelius and Duncan had drifted right over the shoals, and it was at that moment about to enter the eastern passage on the incoming tide. From the mast, Oliver had spotted them. The Horton, with the captain at the wheel, was routing around the shoals to head them off. Captain Knowlton called out, "Driver, men! We'll reach them before they go into the breakers on Cape Jock." The crew jumped at the halyards, each hand knowing what to do before the commands were heard. The schooner skimmed over the water. With the spyglass held to his eye, Oliver also noticed another ship flying the American flag was east in the passage, about 4 miles out. The ship was running slow, without her topsail lifted. Within the half hour, the Horton was within rowing distance of the dory. "Here you go, Mate Knowlton." Oliver turned to see the captain holding 2 pairs of oars. "Take another man and row these out to Duncan and Cornelius." Dropping a dory over the side, Oliver and Anson delivered the oars. Aside from having to continuously bail the dories from the sea washing over, the 2 men didn't come out of it too bad. They were no more wet than usual, and of the cheese and bread they joked they'd made a relaxing cruise of the afternoon. This was only after they'd given Oliver a seaman's round of swears, but then the joking began. "You could have left us a jug of rum, Oliver," shouted Duncan while rowing back to the ship. "Aye, or a young maiden to make us our lunch at least," added Cornelius. No matter if it was Oliver's fault or the men's for not checking for the oars before casting their painter, it didn't matter for the jeering. Had Oliver not been a relative of the captain, the tongue-lashing would have been far worse. He let them have their fun, giving it all turned out okay in the end. With all the chiding while watching the dories approach, none of the crew noticed how close the other American vessel had gotten to the Horton's port side. "Ahoy there!" The call from the speaking trumpet came from the captain of the other vessel flying the Stars and Stripes. "Permission to call," came the request. Captain Knowlton responded with typical seaman courtesy and invited the captain aboard. The first noticed oddity was that the captain of the other vessel was rowed over to be lashed to the Horton's iron rungs by a 12-man Senbow crew and not in a dory. Maybe it was the crew's lingering laughter at the expense of Oliver, or the high of the Horton's largest mackerel catch of the season. Whatever the reason, Captain Knowlton and the entire Horton crew received a most unwelcome surprise once all 13 unknown seamen were on the deck of the schooner. Such a Cape Jock welcoming committee might have been anticipated had Captain Joseph Knowlton not been in such good humor from the successful mackerel haul. His mood turned as sour as herring pickling juice once his recognition of the injustice being committed was realized. Chapter 3. Harbor Blues. What looms upon our starboard bow, what hangs upon the breeze? It's time the good ship hauled her course about the old Saltees, and by her wondrous spread of sail, her long and tapered spars, we found our morning visitor was an English man of war. Old Sea Ballad. Thank you for listening. This has been an audiobook preview. You can now download the ebook from Apple Books. Print books are available at TommyCarbone.com, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and can be ordered wherever books are sold.